Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for this afternoon. I am joined today by Dr. Robyn Kingler-Vidra. Hi, Robyn. How are you?
Hi, Fabio. Hi, everyone.
Welcome and good to see you again. The title of today's webinar is How to Boost Diversity and Inclusion in Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And we're going to be hearing from Robyn. Robyn is currently a senior lecturer in political economy at King's College in London. And previously, she was between 2013 and 2016 head of policy research at the Collier Institute of Venture in Tel Aviv. She holds a BA in political science from the University of Michigan and an MSc and a PhD in international political economy from LSE. She has worked in financial institutions, including hedge funds, for around 8 years before then pursuing an academic career. And part of her work has led her to gaining extensive international expertise in the role of diversity and inclusion in business and in innovation. And that's why she is here today. So she has worked with Innovate UK, with the UNPD, and most recently with us on some of our programs in helping us understand this angle to diversity and inclusion. So welcome, Robyn.
Thanks very much, Fabio, and thanks everyone for joining. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's sunny but windy, so let's hope that we have the sunny version of things here online.
Yeah, it's hailing here, so I don't know what that is a sign of. But before we start, just a couple of reminders. My colleague Egizia is monitoring the chat, so any questions that come in, please ask them to the chat. And also, I believe that a recording of this webinar will be sent to all participants afterwards. So the way this will work, for the next half an hour, I will be discussing a few questions with Robyn, and we're going to keep it sort of an open discussion between the two of us. And then hopefully we will have a few questions from the audience if there are any. So, Robyn, let's start with the basics here. Let's go from the very sort of beginning of things, and let's start with defining diversity and inclusion and as terms, and also let's say as disciplines, as academic disciplines.
Sure, great. And I'm glad that you're starting with the concepts, with the definitions, because it's really an important thing that, and as we spoke about last month in our sessions together. So diversity and inclusion, of course, major buzzwords now, but to say that diversity and inclusion are in fact distinct things. So they're often spoke about together, of course, in D&I, but diversity is quite simply having people and groups and firms, depending on the way that you're thinking about it, who come from and represent different backgrounds. So having this sort of physical or virtual presence of people and firms, groups from different backgrounds. Inclusion is not about the presence of diversity, of difference, but rather about this sense of belonging, about feeling included in particular. And maybe just to sort of give away the next point, that inclusion is in many ways harder than diversity. Diversity is bringing people to the table, but as Verna Myers, who is an important thinker in this space, says, you know, diversity is being at the dance, but inclusion is being asked to dance and being on the dance floor, being part of it, having a voice, and really feeling like you're part of things and valued.
So you would say that they are, you know, interlinked but different, and would you say they're equally important, especially in the context that we're talking about now?
So they're very much interlinked. So you have to have both in order for it to do the intent of what we're hoping for. So to have the, you know, people talk about the leaky pipeline, that if you don't have enough people, you know, and we often talk about sort of demographic groups and thinking in terms of diversity, in terms of gender, ethnicity, race, age, sexual orientation, disability status. If there isn't sort of enough difference to begin with, there's a leaky pipeline. And so then the ability to be inclusive and to benefit from drawing and enabling all these different people to have a voice isn't there. So you sort of maybe think of diversity as the building block and the first step, and then inclusion being the necessary next step. And without inclusion, diversity alone won't have the desired effects.
So it's more of an ecosystem change that needs to include these as priorities. And you touched upon this in what you just said. So the diversity and inclusion have been circulated as buzzwords or as things that have often potentially a societal agenda or a social agenda. But your approach to this is fairly different. And the reason why we started working together, for those on the webinar who don't necessarily know what we do, is in our programs, in our innovation and entrepreneurship support programs, we started working with Robyn to start understanding how having the concepts behind diversity and inclusion in business and in innovation can actually help launch entrepreneurs and help sort of commercialize innovation and help the business aspect of things on top of having a social impact. So in the context of innovation, Robyn, why do diversity and inclusion matter, and how do they impact innovation and business?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And to say that in your introduction to the webinar, you mentioned, so I've done work with Innovate UK and UNDP, and in looking at inclusive innovation ecosystems and policy across Europe, North America, and Southeast Asia, there's an interesting similarity in the sense that there's an awareness that, and this phrase that's often used, that innovation has a direction. Innovation is not neutral. It's socially constructed, and it accentuates the extent to which sort of capitalism and the economy moves faster, right? Innovation is all about boosting productivity so that our inputs are more effectively used or become more productive. So if innovation does not purposefully take distribution into account, the pace and the direction of innovation has the real potential to accentuate inequality in a number of different ways. In terms of, and we see it in thinking about things around employment and the redundancies that come with technology, in particular, replacing jobs, so more manual jobs and increasingly also white collar jobs being replaced by technological innovations. And also the likelihood that, again, without sort of putting inclusiveness and societal distribution at the core of the agenda of thinking about innovation and its direction, the potential for the pace of innovation to, and particularly technological innovation, to sort of mainstream biases into particularly the technologies and the systems that we design. So from a number of perspectives about who's being included socially and sort of cognitively, what we're, not even aware of what we're baking into the systems that we're producing and taking us into the future without purposefully thinking about diversity and inclusion, the propensity for greater inequality and a direction that maybe we wouldn't want is much greater. And I should say that I came to that as being a researcher who looked at venture capital policy and looking at science and technology policy and looking at different types of promoting innovation. So research and development, building national innovation ecosystems, national systems of innovation. And over the last decade, seeing again and again that there's this tendency, particularly in policy and academic literature on the topic, to think about just mainstream innovation and boosting the number of patents, the number of unicorns, the number of winning large firms, and realizing again and again that, well, wait a second, let's think about what's the social point of this, who wins, who are we innovating for, and what impacts does that have?
Yeah, so I guess there's also the element of not just whether we are considering this from an innovator's perspective, but also who are those innovations going on to impact, and how do we make sure that, well, the new technology, the new opportunities are considering this when they're considering their target markets, when they're considering the kinds of regions they want to target as well. So I think that sort of leads me on to another point, which is, again, it kind of links to what we said, but there is a growing sentiment around the fact that this is potentially the right thing to do from a societal perspective. That including, when it comes to things like having programs for female founders, or having programs that specifically target entrepreneurs from certain ethnic minorities or for certain backgrounds. There is a sentiment that this is the right thing to do, but your research has shown that there is also a business case for it, that there is an element of increased performance and increased productivity that's linked to it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so the way that we've looked at it in research is in 3 types of benefits. So, and I'll link with others. So McKinsey, for instance, has published a number of studies since 2014 about why diversity matters. And that's a good example of the studies that have found that more diverse teams measured in terms of gender as well as ethnicity tend to outperform in terms of EBITDA firms that are less diverse. So there's a financial performance, financial return on investment evidence that innovation that is inclusive and firms that are more diverse do better. The social benefits that I alluded to before, that with putting diversity into the diversity inclusion into the mix of considerations, the technologies that we create for the system are found to reproduce bias less. And then the cognitive benefits, and this is where there's been so much great research by cognitive psychologists, by economists, who measure in different ways the creativity of teams, and looking at the ways in which teams that have a diverse set of participants are more creative in the solutions that they come to. And thinking about diversity in a huge number of ways, in disciplinary backgrounds, and then all of the descriptive and demographic traits that we've spoken about as well. So the cognitive, social, and financial benefits of diversity and inclusion.
Okay, so again, I think the reason why I like the way you approach it, Robyn, is because there is this seeing this from this angle is important, and is also a way of, I guess, convincing certain people, especially policymakers, that there are various reasons and various routes as to why we want to be doing this.
And just to say, Fabio, that's increasingly important in the context of COVID as well, right? So COVID hasn't had an equal impact on all of society. COVID has hurt those who are already most vulnerable. And so just thinking, just this morning, it's been a long day, I do the sort of, I was working on a UNDP Philippines project with the team this morning, and just so aware of the hugely accentuated impact on society's most vulnerable that COVID has had. So it's never been more important to design the direction of innovation in a way that is going to sort of reimagine the world in the sort of recovery as we come out of COVID. That is innovation as a force for good.
Definitely, and this sort of leads me on to the next to my next point, which is the way in which we implement what you're saying has to come from different levels of society and different levels of the innovation ecosystems as well. There is the element of encouraging the innovators themselves, the elements of encouraging the firms that come out of innovation and commercialize innovation. But there's also the element of policymakers on the other side, as well as managers of, for example, universities, technology transfer offices. It's the whole ecosystem. So in terms of strategies and in terms of what can actually be done at these various levels, what are the things that our audience, for example, can take away in terms of what strategies are there out there, and what is being done at the various levels to address this?
That's great. So I can start. I'll start with it, maybe just in the spirit of sticking with the threes. Three types of capital that we can think about boosting. And this often you'll see from a policy perspective in particular, earmarking or siloing finance capital to increase the amount of participation from people from particular groups. And just to say that when we think about inclusion, there's the demographic characteristics that we've mentioned before, so the gender, ethnicity, age, and others. There's also industrial types of inclusion and also spatial, right? And things like leveling up and moving beyond sort of the big capital cities. So thinking about earmarking finance capital and investment that can support innovators and entrepreneurs who are representing otherwise underrepresented groups or coming from marginalized or underrepresented backgrounds. So finance capital is one. The second is human capital and maybe leveling up skills. And here the efforts are around things like programming boot camps and on-the-job training for entrepreneurs in business planning, how to raise funding, but then also going much further back. And this is more of a policy and systems level, going further back and thinking about STEM education. Right, so there's evidence that the crucial age in which you see demographic groups who go on to later be underrepresented, they tend to start to drop out of STEM between 11 and 14 years old. So from a policy perspective and a system perspective, it's thinking about ensuring that the education system is one that, keeps that pipeline that I mentioned before, that funnel robust in these early crucial years. So finance capital, the human capital, and both these on the job, and then also the bigger sort of educational skill sets, and then social capital. And social capital is a really big one for entrepreneurs, for firms, and also for policymakers. And social capital meaning networking, mentoring, and here there's really great initiatives around things like reverse mentoring, so empowering those who are otherwise underrepresented to bring their skill sets to those at maybe the sort of centers of an organization or center of power. Networking groups that bring together individuals from underrepresented groups, or in the Innovate UK study we found, and the Innovate UK itself has done a quite good job of this, of connecting members of underrepresented groups with the sort of mainstream of the ecosystem as well. So on the individual entrepreneur level, there's ways of thinking about, boosting the human capital of the employees and the partners and the collaborators that one would want to work with, boosting their social networks, their social capital, and thinking about earmarking money as well to overcome, sort of affirmatively overcome what exists now in terms of underrepresentation and marginalization.
And just following on from what you just said, are these strategies that are international, or are they things that are more effective if done at a national level? Because obviously you have experience in the UK, you have experience in lots of different countries in looking at these things.
That's a great question. So they tend to be quite hyper local even. So the ones that are best done. So efforts, the most supranational, let's say, beyond national that are implemented are, say, European Union level initiatives and strategies, but even those will be localized and run on a national basis or on a city or regional level basis. With the distribution and thinking about sort of inclusion in terms of the leveling up, or across a country, the sort of spatial sense, there it's really empowering city or provincial level participants and governments to take ownership, so that it's sort of not coming from far and away, so that it's the phrase that came up a lot in the context of working on this in Vietnam is that it's innovation for, by, and of all. And so to do that, the policy efforts and also the innovators themselves tend to be, and as I said, when it's sort of best done, most effective is when it is very local and very hands-on.
You mentioned leveling up, which is something we've heard a lot of in this country in the past sort of months. And I know we're sort of slightly going off the international element, but I think given the impact the pandemic has had on societies, in your opinion, do you think that there is a way of having a roadmap to rebuilding economies and rebuilding societies with diversity and inclusion at the heart of the agenda? And is that something that is happening, or do you think will happen?
So, and this might be a bit academic, but to say that for academics in political economy in my world, we look at COVID-19 as something called a critical juncture, which means that it's a sort of shock to the system, which gives us this opportunity or forces our hands, some combination of the two, to reimagine the future. And the sort of the major critical juncture that academics in my field will speak about is World War II and how that saw the rise of opening for sort of Keynesian thought and a different view of macroeconomic management. And there's a lot of hope and thought that if there's a silver lining to COVID, it's that it serves as a critical juncture in this regard as well. And that would mean, what is the direction that we want our innovation to go? And so you here, as you say, leveling up, greening the recovery is the UN Human Development Report's theme for this year, and reimagining a world that is, more inclusive, more environmentally friendly. Here, sort of environmental regeneration again and again. So I think that the potential for the better spatial or geographic distribution is a very real one in light of what cities have experienced over the last year with the pandemic, and the increasing, particularly in my work with policymakers across Southeast Asia and in interviews, and also in the UK, I should say, hearing again and again that there's a very acute awareness of the need to provide greater help and greater support for digital skills, overcoming the digital divide for society's most vulnerable. So there's hope, let's say.
That's the message we want to be saying today, Robyn. Right, so shall we have a few minutes left. Echita, do we have any questions coming in from the audience?
Yes, there is a question from Tom Hockaday. Hi, Tom. Nice to have you. And it is about, in the McKinsey reports, for example, is it understood that the connection between diversity and earnings is causation or correlation?
It's a really good question. So in the first McKinsey, and thanks for the question, Tom, in the first McKinsey report, and there's been 3, I would say that they were less sophisticated in teasing out the causal mechanism at work. And as I mentioned, the cognitive benefits along financial, McKinsey has picked up on trying to, and pushing and validating the extent to which it is about the cognitive. It's about the creativity of teams, the creativity of problem solving that helps to drive the outperformance. In their most recent reports, and I'm happy to share links if that would be helpful in the chat later as well. I think they've gotten better at following up the, let's say, the appearance of this is the firm's diversity and this is its EBITDA, and following that up much more with qualitative surveys and others to understand what are the causal mechanisms at work here and trying to unpack what that is. And as I mentioned, I think that this idea that it's about the cognitive power of more diverse teams is one that they've done the most work on identifying and proving. But they've done the best job in the most recent report, I would argue. As we all do, we learn and we iterate.
Are there any other questions, Ajitya?
Yes, please do chat more questions. But in the meantime, I've got one for Robyn.
Go for it.
Can you share, if this is known to the academic community working on diversity and inclusion, do you know of any sort of activities and strategies that have been implemented in universities specifically to foster diversity and inclusion and innovation? Because we obviously seen a lot of outreach in terms of recruiting students from different backgrounds, and but do you know of any initiative specifically for entrepreneurship, or is there a lack in this specific area of universities?
It's a great question. So you're totally right that universities have done a terrific job in widening participation efforts. And each year, I think widening participation to change the demographic mix of who's attending, particularly Russell Group universities. That method for doing it is improving, and the results are showing that year over year, that actually widening participation is improving. In terms of entrepreneurial support and boosting inclusion and who participates in entrepreneurship in universities. So specific examples, there's the Zinc Accelerator, which is a social accelerator that's run or mostly attached to the LSE, which it's a socially motivated social impact accelerator. And it's done a terrific job, in my view, of both putting social missions and social aims on the agenda, and then thinking very carefully about who's the teams coming together and wanting to have a quite diverse set of students who are coming together in order to tackle those societal challenges. I mean, also today, for instance, the King's has the Entrepreneurship Institute that similarly takes diversity and great mix into account in some ways in a widening participation sense with sort of socioeconomic undertones to it, but then also in a lot of rich ways of thinking about what is diversity inclusion in terms of diversity of disciplinary backgrounds. And I think Zinc at LSE does this well, just to say differentially, because it takes a social sciences view of addressing social challenges and thinking about innovation from a social science perspective. And I can say at King's, the Entrepreneurship Institute thinks about disciplinary stretch, thinks about widening participation in a sort of broad way, not in terms of admissions, of course, and thinks about then the demographic traits as well, so gender, ethnicity, and things of this nature. So I think that universities have been very thoughtful about what diversity means, and then how to really offer the most and take the most, let's say, advantage in terms of driving innovation by creating really inclusive environments.
Yeah, thank you. And we've received another question from Tariq. Can you please comment on the effectiveness of executive coaching as an enabler of diversity and inclusion?
So just to clarify, the question being, to what extent can or does executive coaching drive D&I? And I think, I mean, actually, Fabio, I may turn this back to you, because I think this is on the agenda for the program that you and I are working on as well, and thinking about how mentorship and how having role models and being coached can put D&I into the center of what one does. So could I turn that back to you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can try. I mean, so the program Robyn is alluding to is the Leaders in Innovation Fellowship program that we work on together with the Royal Academy of Engineering in London. And the large part of the program is providing mentorship to early stage entrepreneurs in 14 Newton Fund countries. And the way we approach that is very much by trying to build in diversity and inclusion to the pool of mentors we use as a way of driving the thought in the participants who are at a very early stage. So I think, Robyn, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's two elements at play here. One is how within these countries entrepreneurs are supported by the local environment and the local ecosystem. So how is the funding siloed? How are funding decisions made? What kind of support is offered by institutions? And then there is the whole role model and inspirational element, where by having a diverse pool of mentors, by having a diverse pool of alumni we use as well as case studies of success and success stories, that inspiration leads, it effectively builds confidence, and it builds that sense of participation, of what you were saying at the very start of inclusion, of not just being invited for the sake of being invited, but of being invited and feeling like you're part of something and feeling you're participating in something. So from our side, that's the way we try and include that in our programs from the very early design stages.
Yeah, and I think for that the program is really at the forefront of a model that should be followed. And as you say, so there's the sort of identity of who's included, and to have a more diverse set of people as mentors or as coaches. But then it's also what people do and how they think. And I think that mainstreaming, and this is where I've sort of always come from. If I'm honest, I didn't come from diversity and inclusion and sort of came into the world of innovation. I've come from the world of entrepreneurship, innovation, venture capital, and I increasingly see that, be it coaching, mentoring, these different varieties of boosting one's sort of skill set or boosting the ecosystem more broadly, that by putting diversity and inclusion into these mainstream conversations, that's the way that diversity and inclusion is really making advances, as opposed to it sort of living on its own.
And I guess we've seen this when we have started introducing this into some of our programs. The kind of conversations we have often are around understanding what the concepts are and what they mean, but also why they are relevant to innovators and entrepreneurs, which is what we've been talking about here, as in what is the business case behind it, as we have said multiple times. Well, I think we've sort of run out of time. So Robyn, overall, thank you very much for being here with us today. And just sort of a couple of parting thoughts from me, and then Robyn, I'll ask you to comment as well. What we've seen and what Robyn has been talking about is a bit of a shift in the way we talk about diversity and inclusion. And again, it's trying to shift away from the concept of it being the right thing to do or it being on someone's agenda, and more as something that we should consider an integral part of innovation ecosystems, because there is a case for the innovation ecosystem being stronger if it is a more diverse and a more inclusive innovation ecosystem. And as Accenture, we in our programs have been thinking more and more about this and have been trying to implement this when delivering entrepreneurship support around the world. So thank you very much, Robyn, and please feel free to add anything.
Great. No, thanks very much for having me. Thanks for organizing, and thanks to our attendees, and thanks for the great questions. I mean, just to say, my parting comment would be exactly this: that diversity and inclusion is increasingly, the hope is that it should be on the agenda, on the list of things that one thinks about as an entrepreneur, as a policymaker, that it is mainstreamed. And so, if I have a parting soundbite, it's that innovation has a direction. Think about what yours is, right? And not only, well, I don't do D&I or I do. We all do, whether we want to or not. But think about the direction and think about, who do you want to affect? Who are your targets? Customers, beneficiaries. What intended or unintended consequences are you having through the way that you run your business or through your product? Mainstream D&I.
Thank you very much. Jitsia, do you have anything else to add?
Well, yes. So thank you, Robyn, for coming to join us, and thanks, Fabio, for participating. We will share the recording of this webinar via email, so keep an eye out. And in that email, we can include links to Robyn's recent publications. If you have any other questions, please do get in touch with Accenture. We will do our best to grab 10 minutes of Robyn's time and reply to them. And thank you very much for coming. It's been great. And I guess we will continue to think about this issue, and by all means do keep in touch via social media and all of our channels. And again, Robyn,